It's about a topic that is un, unknown to me, and I've spoken to Stefan, a bit in the last weeks about this topic, because I think it's a topic that's maybe very new to a lot of coaches, but still very very useful. And you actually did a lot of studies into it, so um, I'm not going to say anything more about it. Just give it to you, and go ahead. You're able to screen share, and if you want to show us some video or anything like that, you still have to optimize for video sharing.
Perfect. We'll just be with PowerPoint files anyway. Before I start, Mike, Liam, if I go into overtime, please cut me off, because this is a presentation I basically held for the Austrian Federation a couple of weeks ago. And I'll try to condense this as much as possible, but I don't want to keep Liam in the loop, because after all, I know that he's the main event. I'm just a warm-up fight, but I hope I can give you some ideas and teach you a little something. As Mike already said, I hope you can see my screen here.
Yep.
What we are talking about is, or what I am talking about is depressive disorders among competitive athletes. I think especially with COVID, and generally, I think the times that are going on right now, this is a topic that is really important on a global scale, maybe on a general scale for all human beings, but also for competitive athletes. Before I go on any further, guys, if you have any questions, feel free to stop me at any second. Okay, why? You see here, we got Kevin Love, we got DeMar DeRozan, so even NBA athletes, high-paid, really successful NBA athletes have struggled with mental illnesses, with their mental health. So I think it's a topic that's not only important for the general public, but also even more in a sports context, especially considering that, as Mike said, this topic is often stigmatized or not talked about enough. So let's talk about it. As I said, why would we talk about it now? The actuality is one point. Again, a couple of athletes have come out in the last couple of years, last couple of months really, and shared their stories about mental health. I think there are actually the NFL Facebook page just like an hour ago posted a video of Hayden Hurst about how he wanted to commit suicide, and how he rebounded and got back to having a healthy mind in a way. So I think it's a highly recent, highly actual topic in the basketball discourse, as I said. Also, as we'll see in a second, the amount of cases are rising, and I think COVID-19 is a big part and I see this with our athletes in Vienna at my club. I think it's a thing that really can take a toll on the mental health of athletes, as there is a loss of structure, and it's a pretty unknown and pretty special situation. And also, why do I want to talk about it now? I recently graduated from the University of Vienna, and my diploma thesis covered exactly that topic. So as I already hinted at, it's a really recent, actual, important, timely topic even. But despite that, I think it's a topic, it's an issue that's been stigmatized a lot on many levels. On a micro level, self-stigma, maybe individuals, not even just athletes, but individuals chastising themselves and criticizing themselves because they think something's wrong with them because they have a mental illness. It might be a group stigmatization, talking about a group of people, or maybe within a job, a group of people that has experienced burnout syndrome, stuff like that. Telling them or saying about them, they're not resilient enough for that job. And it can be on a macro level, whole society, stigmatizing mentally ill or not mentally healthy people. And I think there's still, to this day and age, like there used to be with other illnesses of the mental and non-mental kinds, there's a lot of misinformation or wrong conceptions about mental health issues, things that we maybe as lay people don't quite understand yet or grasp correctly. And one thing you'll hear me saying often, and I think that's probably the most important thing to understand or to a concept to grasp, depression is an illness. Depressive disorders are an illness, like diabetes, like cancer. It's not like you're just sad or you're a pussy, basically, just because you, don't feel well mentally. It is an illness, in my opinion. I think it just goes beyond plain sadness, as we'll see in a second. One thing that's really important to understand for us, and this is a thing that I think a lot of coaches struggle with to grasp, and I think the general public struggles to grasp as well, is that mental toughness does not equal mental health. I'll give you an example. I don't know how many German speaking or German participants are on here. Let me have a look. But I suppose the most of you, or some of you, might know the name Robert Enke. He was a national team goalkeeper for the German soccer national team. And unfortunately and sadly, he passed away, I think a little over 12 years ago or 13 years ago, as he took his own life in November of 2006, if I'm not mistaken. And you see, a goalkeeper, even at the national team level, has to be a mentally tough player. But being mentally tough does not equal mentally healthy. But at the same time, and that's important, or at the same time, mental coaching and sports psychology, like we have these mental coaches in Austria that pop up like crazy in the last couple of years. And sports psychology, like performance enhancement, cannot replace sports psychiatry. So if an athlete has problems with mental health issues, you cannot just, take them to somebody who's focused with performance enhancement. It's about getting that person better, getting that person healthy as well, or healthy again. I'll skip over this, as we'll see it in a second, what we'll do here anyways, and to save some time. I talked about the actuality of the topic first. So just to give you an idea what depressive disorders, how they are like spread on a global scale and why this is important for us. More than 300 million individuals suffer suffer from depressive disorders worldwide. So let me just close my WhatsApp real quick. Which equals or amounts to 4.4% of the global population. If we look at gender or sex splits, it's 5.1% of all females and 3.6% of all males. As a result, sadly, of these 300 million individuals with depressive disorders worldwide, there's close to 800,000 suicides annually that can be attributed to depressive disorders. This is especially important for us, as many of us are youth coaches, or at least work with young athletes that enter their prime. And suicides are the second most common cause of death among 15 to 29-year-olds, according to 30-year-old statistics by the World Health Organization. If we look at Europe, we see that roughly 12% of all cases are located in Europe, with 40.3 million. And if we look at athlete-specific statistics, depending on the study, and there's really a broad range, somewhere between 4% to 45% of athletes are affected by depressive disorders. What that tells us, if we look at these statistics up here, athletes are affected at a similar or even slightly elevated rate when compared to the general and normal population. Yes. And the outlook, and this is really a sad outlook, is that the prevalence of depressive disorders and other mental health issues will rise in the near future. To give you an idea, 2018, a level was hit that was predicted for 2030. So we outpaced as humanity outpaced our track, outpaced our growth prediction by 12 years. So let's now assume that every one of us has a roster of 15 players. If we say that 4.4% of our players, let's take the smaller number here, have suffered or do suffer from a depressive disorder, that means that per team there's 0.66 depressive players. Obviously, that's not a number that we can really count because it's not a 1 or a 2 or a 0. But to make it, or to put it in more general terms, all of us who have coached more than one season have probably coached a person, an individual, or maybe had a staff member like an assistant coach or a physiotherapist, who have been depressed, are depressed, were depressed, whatever. So I think it's not like this topic surpasses us without affecting us, even as coaches. And I think it's important to understand, even though maybe everybody seems happy-go-lucky all the time, reality is it's more than likely that all of us have already worked with a depressed athlete. And also bear in mind, there's a large number of potentially unrecorded and undiagnosed cases. So I think that 43 million is even a low number. Okay, when do we speak of a depressive disorder? I'll put these slides online anyway, so spare you with the technicalities. I'll just give you a couple of indicators and symptoms. So it would be depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day. Diminished interest and or pleasure in almost all activities. Weight loss or weight gain. Also decrease or increase in appetite. Sleep disturbances or hypersomnia. So increased sleep. Changes in psychomotor speed. Talking slower, talking quicker. Irritable gestures, whatever comes to mind. Fatigue, really important for a sports context. Feelings of worthlessness, self-doubt, low self-esteem, and the likes. So what is a depressive disorder? I'll just read that definition out for you. According to a diagnostic manual given out by the World Health Organization. In the typical mild, moderate, or severe depressive episodes, the patient suffers from lowering of mood, reduction of energy, and decrease in activity. Capacity for enjoyment, interest, and concentration is reduced, and marked tiredness after even minimum effort is common. Sleep is usually disturbed and appetite diminished. Self-esteem and self-confidence are almost always reduced, and even in mild form, some ideas of guilt and worthlessness are often present. So you have a distinction between mild, moderate, and severe episodes. And there are other types of depressive disorders like chronic, bipolar disorder, or seasonal depressive disorder. So let me check the chat real quick before I go on. Okay. So the most important thing for us, obviously, is knowing the symptoms, recognizing the first signs for us as coaches, having an idea of grasping what a player could go through when he or she experiences a depressive episode. So we have affective symptoms, behavioral symptoms, cognitive symptoms, physiological symptoms, suicidal and self-harming behavior, and comorbidities. I'll go into detail a little bit more. Just know that these symptoms can be categorized into multiple clusters. For example, suicidal and self-harming behavior could also, like, I don't know, people cutting themselves, could also be categorized as behavioral symptoms, because obviously it's a form of behavior pattern. But you see a little bit later a couple of examples. So let's talk about affective symptoms first, because those are probably the ones that are most closely associated to depressive disorders. What are affective symptoms? They are emotional symptoms, manifestations of negative emotions mostly. Sadness, for example, probably the one we as lay people mostly affiliate with depressive disorders. Often, depressed people are told to just snap out of it. Yeah, you're just sad, get over it. So sadness is probably the one symptom that's most closely associated. Feelings of despair, emptiness, senselessness, not knowing what to do in this world, not having any form of joy in what you're doing in the world. As I said, loss of joy, feelings of happiness, and especially in regards to things that formerly were enjoyed. I'll talk about this specific symptom in the context of sports a little bit later. Just bear in mind that, for example, an athlete that doesn't like to come to practice anymore, or doesn't hustle on the floor anymore, doesn't give it his all or her all anymore, could be a warning sign. A loss of interest, and at the same time, irritability and low frustration threshold. For example, if a player misses 2 shots in a row, he or she all of a sudden gets super angry and fuck this, I'm not good enough, whatever. This can also be a first sign that something's not right. Cognitive symptoms, which means symptoms that are related to our cognition, our perception, our thoughts, everything that's cognitive related. So low self-esteem. Yeah, a depressed individual perceives himself, herself as worth less than others. Feelings of guilt and negative self-attribution, as I said here. Maybe you played the game of your life and it still wasn't enough, and the depressed athlete might tend to say, "Hey, I'm the reason my team keeps losing," even though he or she has carried that team on his or her back. But these self-attribution tendencies are mostly negative. Negative thought patterns in regards to self and others, that's kind of is intertwined with the negative self-attribution. A distorted self-perception, maybe somebody who's a great shooter loses trust in his or her shot. And also maybe on a more general scale, outside of the court, outside of the playing field, maybe looks, like things like anorexia might be closely related to mental health issues. An individual who might see him or herself not slim enough, not athletic enough. Maybe somebody wants to practice all the time because he feels he's not muscular enough. Like those are, warning signs if somebody displays a distorted self-image, self-perception. Negative expectations for the future, worrying about the future. Will I play well? Things like that, rumination basically. And this type of symptom often is comorbid, means it's linked to another sickness. That's what comorbidity means. It's often connected to anxiety disorders, competitive anxiety, social anxiety, panic attacks. These things are often interlinked. And also important, especially for us coaches, not only are these cognitive capabilities geared towards the negative side of things, their functionality is reduced as well. I think this can also increase self-doubt as the individual doesn't trust his or her perception anymore, or his or her decision skills anymore. An example of reduced cognitive capabilities would be attacking a closeout, for example, making a quick decision or making a decision with confidence, making a decision, like 100% decision, and not just like, how should I say, we have the saying in Austria, if you dive into shit, dive head first, like lacking the courage in a way to make a decisive decision, and memory loss also, for example, running plays correctly, decision speed. Physiological symptoms also important for us and visible for us: fatigue, loss of energy, the occurrence of sleep disturbances. It's a topic I'll go into a little bit later. Can be interrelated and interacting, these two things: depressive disorders and sleep problems. Insomnia, sleepless nights, or hypersomnia, not being able to leave bed, not being able to get up, not wanting to get up, lacking motivation. Changes in diet and weight, maybe eating or hungering oneself can be a way of coping. But also weight loss can be a loss of interest. And here we come back to some symptoms being part of multiple categories. A loss of interest can be obviously an affective symptom, but also here, if it has an effect on the changes in weight, changes in body composition, can also be attributed as a physiological symptom. As I said, weight gain, coping, and also probably most interesting for the neurosurgeons among us, there have been studies that showed that there are structural changes to the hippocampus, a brain area, when there is a chronic depression prevalent, and the size of the hippocampus normally decreases. What that shows is that there is a close and tight connection and interrelation between the psyche of an individual and his or her body and physiological functions. Behavioral symptoms, obviously, I already mentioned it: changes in behavior. Psychomotor activity can be changed, like somebody who's gesturing wildly and moving up and down, can can be also related to speech agitation or speech tempo. As I said, movement, tempo, and patterns. And probably, again, a symptom that is closely associated with depressive disorders would be the paralysis of the will. Probably one of the, next to sadness, is probably one of the most common symptoms and depictions of depressive disorders. Why is that? There's a loss of stimuli. I already mentioned it. Things that were enjoyable to the individual are not enjoyable anymore. As I said, player doesn't show up to practice, maybe shows up late to practice, goes through the motions, for example. On a more general scale, if you notice deterioration in that person's hygiene, him or herself not cutting her hair, not showering anymore, those kind of things, that can be also attributed to paralysis of the will. It can also happen to excessive behavior patterns, or it can also be an effect, overtraining. Yeah, lots of training as a coping mechanism. And avoidant behavior. A great example for avoidant behavior would be a really talented kid who has like limited possibilities for the future, but him or her or he or she decide not to pursue that career path because he or she is afraid of what might follow. Should say talented player who's afraid of next step. And isolation, avoidance of social interactions. If a player is secluded from his teammates, that can also be a sign. Self-harming behavior, I already mentioned it. Suicide is the most extreme manifestation of depressive disorders. Here again, it's really, really important for us coaches to listen to our players, because some things they say, some hints they give via the speech can be really vital for us to understand the mental state of our athletes, because some signs can be passive thoughts of suicide, like not actually saying I want to kill myself, but indicating sentences, saying sentences that basically have the same connotations. For example, I wish I could just disappear. I wish I had never been born. Or active thoughts of suicide. I want to kill myself. And this is when all of the alarm bells have to ring. Also addiction. Alcohol, drugs, gambling, you name it. Again, these are mechanisms to cope with the mental problems. I already mentioned it. Other mental ailments like anxiety disorders, panic disorders can often be intertwined with depressive disorders. And also studies have shown that chronic depressive disorders can lead to an increased risk for other chronic diseases like, as I said, diabetes. And sleep disturbances, a topic which we'll talk about later. Now let's come to the part that's probably the most relevant, the most important for us. And are there any questions until now? Anyone? I think we should be.
I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but it's
perfect. Then I'll just.
It's high level thoughts on these topics, and I'm sure I'm having lots of questions when you're done.
Okay, perfect. And I'll blast through here. Athlete-specific symptoms. It's important for us to understand that at the end of the day, athletes are common people, and I hope you can see my denotations. Have the same symptoms, but at the same time, sometimes symptoms can be absent, or can be reversed altogether. For example, we talked about a loss of interest in sports. You have it here. That'd be a loss of interest symptom, behavioral symptom, for example. But also, some players might seek refuge in competition. Some players might excessively throw themselves into training, into practice, just to make up for something they're lacking otherwise. An important indicator for us is a decrease in performance. But this is super tough for us to attribute correctly, because nobody is at 100% all the time. And you see here, and keep this quote, keep this article in mind for a little bit later. Here, Paul George says that his bad play was in part attributed to having depression in the NBA bubble. I'll just let that stand as it is right here. Okay, I'll just skip over this a little bit. What depressive disorders are not, they're not just chemical imbalances in the brain, and they're not just a faulty perception of the world or plain sadness. What they are, or how they develop via a stress vulnerability model. Here we have a great diagram here. You have certain vulnerabilities. I'll show examples in a second. And if they're combined with either chronic or acute stress, they can, but don't have to, but they can lead to depressive disorders. So what are stressors? There's chronic stress, like financial and social insecurities, injury problems, if we're talking athlete-specific chronic stress, like nagging injuries if your knees is a problematic area for you for years. That's something I think Jason Granger even talked about this issue in a EuroLeague roundtable on the topic of mental health. That'd be an example. Tough living environments, just think about the individuals who are refugees, who come from war-torn areas or from torn families, childhood trauma, stuff like that. Or it could be acute stress, like death in the family, illnesses, as I said, life in crisis areas can also be a shorter one. For example, some of you might have noticed it. Unfortunately, we had our first terror attack in Vienna, or an Austrian ground, in I think 40 years last month. Although it was just one night an attack, and luckily not many people were harmed, you could see in practice that the minds of everybody, coaches included, was all over the place. So this could be a major negative life event as well. And COVID-19, obviously, the loss of structure for athletes. And similar to the symptoms, the borders between these two categories are really blurry. So COVID-19, with it going, 10 months now, can also be classified as a chronic stressor. What are vulnerabilities? Genetic predispositions. If an individual has a relative who suffers from mental illness, it's more likely that that person will suffer from depressive disorders or other mental ailments at some point in their lives, studies have shown. Biological vulnerabilities, cognitive vulnerabilities, like negative self-attribution, self-criticism, rumination, and interpersonal factors like insecurities or dependencies. What are further athlete-specific stressors? And this is probably a really important one. If you've read one of the two, I think the more recent Kevin Love article on the Players Tribune, high athletic identity is a really big factor, a thing we have to think about as coaches. What does that mean? If an individual has a high athletic identity, that means that individual creates his or her self-image, a positive self-worth, through athletic success. I think Kevin Love says he tried to perform his way out of the depression, out of his mental health problems, but it's not that easy. The solution is not that easy. And you see, I just hastily translated these slides from German into English this morning, so please excuse the typos. I will correct it and load it up then. A loss of structure also destroys this athletic identity. Again, think COVID, or think later stages of a career. For example, if you transition out of playing into coaching, or out of playing into a normal accounting office job, whatever, if you have a high athletic identity, a major part of your personality, of your identity, it just crumbles away, it's taken away from you. And this can also lead to a loss of structure and the loss of security in a way. Pressure, competition, pressure to perform. The media, obviously, like all of the tabloids and outlets, and Skip Bayless talking his nonsense, and Charles Barkley chastising players. And I've mentioned those two names in particular, you'll see in a second. Internal pressure, perfectionism, and overtraining. This is a thing that's really important. If our players become tired, they're also more prone to depressive disorders, and vice versa. Again, there's an interrelation between depressive disorders and overtraining. They both can occur connected. And for the NFL fans among us, or pro wrestling fans, concussions are a big issue as well. I highlighted perfectionism, and I think this is the second to last type of stressor and vulnerability. before we go into how to help athletes. So we're nearing the finish line. Negative perfectionism, as opposed to positive perfectionism, here perfectionistic concerns, can be classified as the fear of making mistakes. If I'm a positive or positive perfectionist, somebody who strives for perfection, my goal might be to be the best that I can be, to grow and reach my maximum. A person that's perfectionistically concerned, on the other hand, is not concerned with success, but more concerned with fear of failure, fear of making mistakes. I want to be the best because I'm afraid of what happens when I make mistakes. I'm afraid of being exposed, and I'll tear myself to shreds during games, maybe over a minor mistake, or during coaching. I mean, all of this, what I'm telling you, applies to coaches as well. What I found, and I did a large study on this with European basketball, soccer, and individual sport athletes. And what this study found, that there's a positive correlation between athletes that display perfectionistic concern patterns and those who display or suffer from depressive disorders. What that means in lay terms is that the higher the tendency for perfectionistic concerns, according to a scale, was, the more likely that person suffered from depressive disorders. So there are scales and questionnaires to find that out. That would be too much here to explain. Also, perfectionism and negative perfectionism and poor sleep quality are interrelated as well, and their connections to anxieties, social and competitive anxiety, that is. Okay, sleep, the final big topic. Probably makes sense that there is a negative correlation between sleep quality and depressive disorders. Again, the worse the sleep index, again, you can investigate that by a couple of questionnaires, the more likely a depressive disorder is among athletes. And the loss of sleep, and this is also important for us as coaches, our decision-making process, our mood, and our shape, our physiological condition worsens with less sleep, obviously. But again, we talked about this with depression and then competitive anxiety. There's a bidirectional interrelation. You see a nice German diagram. And here, again, for the German speakings, it's a chicken and an egg, and the nurse asks, who was here first? Maybe the poor sleep quality leads to depression, or the depression leads to poor sleep quality. Often it's not that easy to distinguish. What are some athlete-specific symptoms of poor sleep? A reduction in cognitive skills, as already said, slow decision-making, a risk of injuries, and vice versa, the improvement of sleep quality, and especially for working with young athletes in the 15, 16, 17, 18 range. The better they sleep, the better they recover, the better they'll be able to adapt after practicing. The better they'll be able to improve. So this is an important mechanism we as coaches also need to understand how to use in order to improve the performance of our athletes, but also maintain their mental health. Why do athletes sleep worse? According to Donald and Driller, it's a worse sleep index than the general population. One problem could be schedule, youth competitions, like Paul can attribute or can confirm that at the FIBA Eurobasket for under 16 or under 18, you play 8 or 9 games in 11 days. Something we call Englische Wochen here in Austria, English weeks, playing up to 3-4 games up to 3-4 games per week. I call it the Mourinho here because he's famous now for posting pictures whenever Tottenham loses that they have practice the next day at 11 in the morning. So early practices after games can negatively impact sleep wellness, and double headers like NBA games, Final Fours, and whatnot. Also travel, obviously, multinational competitions. Think of EuroLeague and also their crazy schedule with double headers in EuroLeague, where teams play up to 4 games a week. and long bus rides, driving from one end of the country to the other. And also competitive anxieties, worrying about the performance the next day or also after the game, being angry or disappointed in oneself can also lead to a loss of sleep. We as coaches also know that phenomenon after bad games. Important here to notice or to note, the biggest barrier is the social stigma. What is a social stigma? It's a negative labeling of groups, individuals, and affected individuals. Actual traits are connotated negatively, like sadness or anxiety. Give an example. Somebody suffers from anxiety, or anxiety is disorder. A stigma would be that person is not capable of playing in a high performance environment because he's too afraid of the big moment, for example. While that might be true for some players, it for sure is not true for all players. And these social stigmas are often generalized and pressed upon individuals suffering from said illness. Assumptions and artificial connotations, as I said. How are these stigmas developed? Misinformation and misconceptions are big part. Lack of knowledge when compared to other diseases, other illnesses. Avoiding individuals who suffer from these illnesses, prejudices, and they exist on multiple levels. I already talked about this. Obviously, stigma affects the whole life of affected individuals. Why? Because stigma is a form of seclusion. And this, I think, is an immense problem in pro sports. I love this quote unquote, or it's not a quote, but it's just an example quote. It's a quote unquote. Why would an NBA player be depressed? They earn millions of dollars doing what they love. And I just showed you this article about, or this headline about Paul George. You see here, Charles Barkley rips Paul George for blaming struggles on anxiety and depression. Same thing here, Skip Bayless, one of the worst people in sports media, I suppose. Our English-speaking listeners maybe know better, but he also has no sympathy for sharing his depression struggles. So you see the stigma is super prevalent still. Okay, I'll just skip here. One thing we do have to understand, though, is the performance pressure, and many of us work or have worked in high performance environments, and mental health are a difficult relationship. What we as coaches probably cannot do is to go out and like be friends with everybody and everything's like super nice and try to help our athletes. Actually, we have to help our athletes, but at the same time it would be foolish, or would be naive, I should say, to assume that we don't work in an environment where we have to win games, where we have to build our program, where we have to develop players. But at this, these quotes and these sayings, players have to perform, they have to function in our system. And I think this is a dangerous sentence, to function in a system, because at times I think, especially with the skills of some of these athletes at the end of the day are human beings. It doesn't matter if you're, I don't know, Kyle Hines, who's one of the most decorated EuroLeague athletes of all times and a machine in what he does. At the end of the day, he is a human being. And I think with high performance athletes, it's kind of easy to forget that. So my food for thought is also, is an ACL tear or any other injury, insert, I don't know, injury here, concussion, broken ankle, whatever, is it all that different from a depressive disorder? I don't know. Maybe it is, maybe it ain't. Because both lead to a decrease in performance or an inability to perform, and both are treatable via surgery, via medication, via therapy. So I think it's time for us as coaches to start to think of mental illnesses in a similar vein, at least, as physical problems. So I got a question for you, and please give your answer in the chat. Who's the most decorated Olympic athlete of all time?
Just before we're answering those questions, we're on the 5 minute mark before we hit.
Oh wow! Okay, well then I just hurry up. So anyone who's got an idea?
Coach Melanek already put it in the chat. Phelps, 100
100 points for Coach. It is Michael Phelps. And he has shared in an interview that there were times where he didn't want to be alive. So again, mental health issues or illnesses do not mean that a person cannot be mentally tough and up for the task for great performances, but vice versa, being up for the task and being a great Olympic performer doesn't mean that that person is mentally well. Okay, since we're at the 5-minute mark, I'll cut to the chase and I just go to what we as coaches can do, because that's probably the most important thing. We can do a lot, but we can't do everything. We can't heal our athletes unless we're psychotherapists or sports psychologists. The most important prerequisite, and I love this quote in an interview by my dear friend Martin Schiller of Stalgiris Kaunas, when asked about how he can help as a coach, he can help his players during the COVID situation. I think the most important prerequisite is having empathy, trying to relate to the players, trying to be just a human being, recognizing them as a human being to help them if they go through a tough stretch. And I always like to say open eyes to see if there are signs, open ears to hear what they are saying, and also open doors. Show your players, show your athletes that you care and that you're here to help them. Also reducing stigma, probably by having an open approach to all of this, that helps. And let's give you a 4-step model, actually a 5-step model. The first step would be mental health literacy. And again, I'll just breeze through the slide. It means educating your players, your staff about what mental health issues are. What is a depressive disorder? How can you treat it? Basically what I'm doing for you guys here. That's the first part. And if there's somebody with a mental health issue, I love this 4-step model for creating supportive environments. It's an Australian model by Sevens, Hussman, Crisp, and Wensley. 4 steps. Number 1, recognition, as we already talked about, seeing conspicuous behavioral patterns, recognizing symptoms. Number 2, reaching out. This entices talking to athletes, offering support, offering safe environments without social stigmas, without the athlete having to fear of being judged or whatever. But then, as I said, we cannot do everything. So the third really important part is referral. Help the athlete find a professional, either a therapist or a doctor or whatever, but help them find somebody that can help them more proficiently and professionally than you as a coach could do. And the 4th part, remaining supportive. Sending the athlete to somebody that can help them is not the last part. It doesn't end there. And I think it has a lot to do with empathy. So showing interest in the road to recovery, remaining updated, also shows the player, the athlete, the individual, that he or she is valued no matter how he or she feels, how he or she is doing. So I think that's the 4th part that should not be skipped. Okay, sleep is obviously important as well. Treatment is not that important. I'll just put some material up here. If you're interested in learning more about this, these are some links. I can also, I sent this to Mike already. If you want to read my diploma thesis, I'd be happy to share that with you as well. And yeah, I don't know how much time we got left, but if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
I got one, but that's no surprise, maybe because we have talked about this for some times. What do you think is one of the important things now in this lockdown? Maybe you don't see your players that often. You only see them in groups because you're not allowed to train in your full capacity. They have a different structure to life because of delay of seasons or changing in season games. What do you think is important now without seeing people that we can do?
I think the most important thing, and it comes back down to empathy, is like staying connected with your players, like asking them, how are you doing? Is there anything I can do for you? Keeping them in the loop. Again, the structure, the loss of structure, as you rightfully said, is a big issue. Maybe, I don't know, schedule a weekly Zoom call, just something they can hold on to regain some form of structure. I think that's the most important part. But again, at the same time, don't overestimate what you as an individual who's maybe not trained in that field can do. I think if you just have one takeaway in everything you do in terms of interpersonal coaching, having empathy and trying to, be a human being, as stupid as that may sound, but be a human being in connection with your players or in interaction with your players.
That's great. As we're about to close this one off, I think you can be reached via different ways to contact you about any of this stuff. I think most important part now, that's a lot of food for thought, is that we have a small 2-minute break.